go by Dr. Shubha. That's what my patients call me because unlike the smart lady there, a lot of people can't pronounce my last name. But anyway, I'm a nephrologist at UC Davis Medical Center, and I'm a general nephrologist, so I don't work with a transplant team. I'm like your nephrologist who takes care of patients pre-dialysis and on dialysis, and post-transplant as well after the initial part is done. So thank you very much for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the Bay Area Association of Kidney Patients and Linda and all the co-directors for inviting me. What we're going to do in the next, say, 40 minutes is we're going to do basically talk about some common kidney labs and how you can incorporate that into your life as a kidney patient, and how to, because my honest opinion is the more we understand about what we're dealing with, the better we can handle it, and I'm sure you all agree with that. So what I'd like to do is keep this very, very interactive. So it's going to be a lot of back and forth, and I want you guys' participation, and I think that keeps it more, interesting, so to speak. So let's get started. Just an introduction about what the kidneys do. As you all know, I found this picture online, and I found it very interesting that, there's a faucet and it opens into the filter, which is the kidney, and you get pure water there, which is what it's supposed to do when the kidney is nice and healthy and functioning, and you get good urine. And what happens when the kidneys don't function properly is basically three major things. Number one, some substances that need to be eliminated in the urine don't get eliminated, and so they get retained in the blood. Like, I'll give you an example, BUN, creatinine, and we're going to talk about all this in detail. Phosphorus, potassium. Some substances, turns out, are not produced by the kidney. Anyone knows out of an example of what the kidneys may be making that it doesn't make when the kidneys don't work? It's up there. Erythropoietin. You guys might have heard about that word. It's a kind of a long word, but I'll explain more about what that means. Erythropoietin is a substance the kidney doesn't make, and we'll see why that's important. And last but not least, the kidney being, it's a small, pretty tiny organ, we all have two of them, but it turns out that it's like one of the master organs in the body and affects pretty much every bodily function. So, where does my talk fit into all this? What we are going to be basically focusing about is these two. What happens when the kidneys don't do what they're supposed to do? How is it reflected in your lab work? Because pretty much the substances that are retained in the blood, we do not know unless we check for it. In other words, it's a silent disease. You all might have known chronic kidney disease as a silent disease until your advanced renal disease, when you start developing symptoms and the patient needs dialysis or transplant. Which is why this is a very common question I get asked by my patients. Doctor, I was told I have kidney disease, but I still pee a lot. How can I have kidney disease? Turns out, this is a very important thing that I think patients should understand. The kidney basically does two things. One, it cleans the blood. And second, it eliminates the water. So when there is chronic kidney disease, even till the very end, the patient can be making perfectly normal urine, except that the urine doesn't contain all the bad stuff mixed in it, so it builds up in the blood. So it's completely possible for a patient to be making urine even till advanced kidney disease, and typically that's what happens. So the only way you know is through your lab tests, which is why it's so important to know what they mean. And we're also going to be touching a little bit on the second one. Now, everyone familiar with this? This is the dreaded lab report, especially for patients on dialysis. I know what you got. I know, you know what I'm talking about. You have this monthly lab reports, right? That the dietitian comes and gives you. Sometimes they give you a smiley face. Yeah, and some people are shaking their heads no. Sometimes you get a smiley face, sometimes you don't get a smiley face, depending on the lab results. And your report card can pretty much tell you how these chemicals are sort of behaving in the body. Because like I said, being a silent disease, you really need those lab results to tell you how internally you're doing. I'm going to play this, and you guys can tell me. This just goes on and on and on, right? I mean, there's like a ton of lab results that typically you may see. But I'm going to focus on a specific few that I think are very important for all the patients to understand. And I highlighted some of them here, but we'll go over some of them in greater detail. Now, like I said, it's going to be a little bit interactive from this point on, this slide on, okay? Now, what does this mean, the BUN and the creatinine? What does BUN and creatinine mean? Do all of us have it? Do only patients with kidney disease have it? We all have BUN and creatinine, okay? We all have BUN and creatinine because BUN is a breakdown product of protein. And we all eat protein, so we break down and our body makes burn. And creatinine is a product that comes from muscle. Our muscles are making it constantly. So what happens is, you're constantly generating the BUN and the creatinine, and the kidney is supposed to eliminate them. So at any point in time, if I take a blood test and look at the levels of the BUN and creatinine, and I find that they are higher, indirectly I'm guessing the kidney is not doing its job. Simple? Now, what about GFR? What does that mean? Your kidney doctor might have talked to you about GFR. Can I have a show of hands? How many of you have heard of the term GFR? Everybody, excellent. Turns out that GFR is nothing but a measure of how your kidneys do. It is not something that I measure in your blood. It's derived from what I measure in your blood. Slightly different, okay? In other words, I tell the computer what the patient's creatinine is, and the computer tells me what the patient's GFR is. So, like Dr. Trotman mentioned before, roughly the GFR for a normal person, roughly, okay? Think of it as 100 or 100% kidney function. When your GFR is reported as 50, approximately it means you have 50% kidney function. When the GFR is reported out as 20, approximately, again these are all approximates, but it works fairly well, approximately 20% of your kidneys are working. And you all might have heard about the stages of kidney disease. They're actually based on the GFR, okay? And I'll show you that. How many of you have seen this in your doctor's offices? There's usually a poster with all the stages of kidney disease. I kind of don't really, tend to focus too much on the actual stages because for two reasons. Number one, I feel it tends to create anxiety in some patients, Oh my God, I'm in stage 3 kidney disease. What does that mean? There's only 2 more stages and then I need dialysis. So it does create a bit of anxiety, but I tell my patients, just because you're in stage 3 does not necessarily mean you'll go to stage 4 and 5. You can live in stage 3 or live in stage 4 for a long period of time if you take care of those kidneys. So it's not 100% inevitable progression. Well, a lot of patients will progress, but please bear in mind that there's a lot of things we can do to sort of halt that progression. So the stages really it's good to know them, but try not to dwell too much on them. And really it's based on, what your GFR or that percent kidney function is based on, okay, the stages. I sometimes tell my patients the seesaw analogy to explain what the GFR means and the creatinine. Say you have a lab, this is especially true for pre-dialysis patients. As you're following your kidney function, the lab printout is going to say creatinine, say 2 or 2.5, and you're going to get a GFR printout. How do you sort of correlate the two? I tell my patient the seesaw analogy. On one side is the creatinine and on the other side is the GFR. In other words, if your creatinine starts going up, the GFR is coming down. So we use the creatinine as a marker, indirect marker of the GFR, okay? I would like you guys to understand that, because you will find in your trend, if you trend your labs over time, say the past few years, you might find the creatinine is slowly going up and correspondingly the GFR is coming down. So remember this analogy and it will help you understand how to interpret your labs, okay? Now, okay, quiz time. I want you guys to tell me, we have all these labs, right? We're going to split it into three components: pre-dialysis patients, dialysis patients, and post-transplant patients with a well-functioning kidney. Who wants to take a first stab at this? Tell me, if you're a pre-dialysis kidney patient or a dialysis or a post-transplant patient, which group of patients are these three labs most important? Like, you want to really pay attention and talk to your doctor about. Take a stab at it. BUN, creatinine, and GFR. Which group needs to pay attention to this? Anybody? Let's see. Somebody said pre. Now I'm going to put a star. Okay? If you're right, I'll put a star. Who said pre-dialysis? Very good. So if you're a pre-dialysis patient, please pay attention to the creatinine and the GFR. What about dialysis patients? Do they have to pay attention to their lab reports and see what the GFR is, what the creatinine is, and the burn is? What do you guys think? It's a trick question. Turns out, not that important, because we use the creatinine and the GFR to tell you changes in kidney function. In other words, if the patient who is before pre-dialysis is going to go on dialysis and so on, we follow the GFR. But once a patient is on dialysis, turns out it's not that important, because your function is taken over now by the dialysis machine or the peritoneal dialysis, right? So it's okay if your creatinine is 10, for example. No problem. Does that make sense? How about post-transplant patients with a normal functioning kidney? Is that important to pay attention to creatinine? Absolutely, because that's the only way you'll know how good your transplant is working. Okay? So, let me give you the stars in the right places. All of you who got the stars in the right places, you can give yourself a hand. So, important, I'm not saying ignore it if you're a dialysis patient. I'm saying if you're pre-dialysis or transplant, these numbers are very important to follow. Any questions on what BUN, creatinine, and GFR mean? Any questions so far? We'll move on to the next lab. Some of you, I was told, already have your lab sheets with you. And, like I said, we'll make it interactive. So if you want to interject and ask some questions while we are going over a particular lab test, please feel free to do so. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just curious. So when they say like below 60 or above 60, they don't really give you a number except just this below. So how do you know?
Exactly. If the GFR says above 60, okay, you don't have to worry too much about it, because according to the classification of CKD or chronic kidney disease, less than 60 is when they really recommend even seeing a kidney doctor, unless you don't have lots of protein, unless you have lots of protein in the urine, for example. So above 60, they wouldn't even tell you, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. If it is less than 60, then they will tell you. But they will not tell you if you're, say, older, say above the age of 70, it does not get automatically reported. So you will need to talk with your kidney doctors to ask them, what is my GFR? Because if you just look at the creatinine, it's going to tell you a number, 2.5, 2.6. What does that mean? Well, my creatinine is 2.6 or my creatinine is 4. I have no idea what that means. The real money is in the GFR, because that's what's telling you the kidney function. And like I said, the lab usually will report it out in your lab sheet. But if you're over the age of 70, for instance, they will not report it out directly because of, there's a number of reasons for that. But you can ask your kidney doctor. They'll be able to do some calculations and tell you. Does that answer your question?
If someone is on CFPD,
yes.
What is the equivalence in terms of GFR?
So if you're on dialysis already, the assumption is your GFR is typically less than 10, right? So what we do is we typically don't tend to tell the patient, well, now your GFR is 5 or GFR is 6, because it doesn't really matter in the big picture, except that one word of caution that I would use, one little caveat there is, if you're on PD and if you still make a lot of urine and that's something called residual renal function, you would need to maintain that. So even if you have GFR of 2 or 3, it would be important to maintain that. That's beyond the scope of this topic though.
Can you lower your creatinine and also raise your GFR with diet?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Turns out that when you have progressive chronic kidney disease, right, there is actually scar tissue forming in the kidney. And I show my patients this example. See, I have a scar in my arm here. Now, once that scar tissue is formed, it's very unlikely for it to go back looking like the normal skin. What we can do is prevent the rest of the normal skin or the rest of the normal kidney from turning into a scar. Does that make sense? In other words, if your creatinine is at, say, 2, right, and you have progressive kidney disease, we don't typically expect it to get better unless, and this is a big caveat here, unless you may be on certain medications, which, for instance, like water pills or certain medications like ACE inhibitors, which can temporarily increase the creatinine. And when you withdraw those water pills, then your creatinine may get a little better, but not too much typically. It might look better on the paper. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to tell you is the idea of following the creatinine is to see how much scar tissue formation is there in the kidney. Now say there is scar tissue formation, your kidney function is now down to 30%, right? Diet-wise, there's a lot of things diet and medication-wise we can do to prevent the rest of the kidney from becoming scar tissue.
Yeah, sure.
Okay?
Is that why they expect you to do increasingly more dialysis?
Say that again.
Is that why certain patients are expected to do more dialysis
To maintain?
The output, the water output?
No, not necessarily. See, the creatinine and the GFR, like I said, once you are established on dialysis, it turns out it's not that important to monitor that periodically. It's more important in the pre-dialysis and the post-transplant patients. So I'll talk about that more dialysis, it's coming up. But that's based on a totally different lab. It's not based on the creatinine. I'll come to that. Okay, can we move on? Shall we move on? Okay, let's move on to potassium now. Now, what's so special about potassium? What's so special about potassium is that the kidney is sort of the main regulator of potassium in the body. In other words, we take in potassium in our diet, most of the potassium comes from the diet, and we eliminate it through the kidneys, through the urine. Now, when the kidneys don't eliminate the potassium, it builds up in the body, and when it's over a certain danger level, have you guys, any of you heard about certain danger levels, potassium? What are some numbers they usually say? 7 and 8, exactly. But even when it goes in the high 5s or the low 6s, your kidney doctor may be worried about it because we don't want it to reach 7 and 8. Does that make sense? So, in other words, a normal healthy level is between 3.5 and 5, but as it starts inching up to the high 5s and the low 6s, we may have to be thinking about, wait a minute, we may have to do certain interventions here to get that level into more normal ranges, because when it goes to 7 and 8, then there's a real danger of having heart problems, okay? Now, quiz time. Which patient needs to pay attention to potassium? Pre-dialysis. What about dialysis and post-transplant? Dialysis. What about post-transplant with a well-functioning kidney? Probably not. If your kidney is working fine, it's going to eliminate the potassium, right? So, in other words, if you're a pre-dialysis patient or a patient on dialysis, remember, you have to pay attention to the monthly labs or the Q3 monthly labs if you're pre-dialysis to see what the potassium levels are. Now, next question to you guys. What is the problem with potassium maintenance when you have kidney disease? Can you guys throw out some problems you might have faced? What is the problem with maintaining potassium balance, you know?
Changing your diet.
Beautiful. Excellent. Excellent. It's because of this. Look at that. Who wouldn't want to eat that, right? It's all good for you stuff when your kidneys are functioning.
Yeah, and you can't eat it.
Right, and you can eat it. That is one of the biggest problems. It's because all the good foods are what we are being told growing up as a kid. You know, I tell my son who is sitting there, I tell him, eat your fruits and vegetables, right? We've been told that as a kid. That's the big problem. And now you have kidney disease and we still want to eat them, and you know, nobody's to blame for it. They're all good for you, except that they're very rich in potassium and there is a real problem with the kidneys eliminating them. What's the other problem? What's the other problem that we are facing day in and day out with kidney patients not able to reach their potassium goals? Any other problem? This is a big one. Medications, right? Especially, some of you may have heard of these medications, lisinopril, losartan, all the prills, you know. The medications that end with a prill, lisinopril, ramipril, fosinopril, all the prills, right? They are all actually very good kidney protective medicines, except that they come with a price. The price is they retain potassium. They hold on to potassium. They tell the kidney not to eliminate the potassium. So this is the biggest challenge, these two, when it comes to dealing with potassium for both the pre-dialysis patient and the dialysis patients. Yes?
Just had a question. How fast does the potassium level of blood reflect your diet? What's the response to that?
Please repeat the question.
Yes, the question was, how fast does the potassium intake reflect in your blood test? And I'll give you an answer for that. I'll give you the short answer is it can be pretty immediate. For example, you have a weekend without dialysis. For this, especially true for dialysis patients, right? Say you get dialyzed on a Friday. Saturday and Sunday, say it's Thanksgiving weekend or Christmas dinner or something. And, you know, we tend to, I had a patient like that, you know, she had a particularly, you know, heavy weekend and ate a lot of good stuff. Monday morning, she comes to the dialysis unit and sits in the waiting room waiting to be called, and she couldn't move. She couldn't move from the chair. We actually had to, she actually had to be lifted to be brought in, and we checked her potassium level. Turns out it was at 8.5. Once she got on the machine and the potassium started to come out, she could actually move her legs. So it can be pretty immediate, especially for dialysis patients, because you have no defense mechanism, right? If you're pre-dialysis, you know, at least some of the kidneys are working, so you have some of a defense mechanism. But if you're on dialysis, I would be extra careful. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So this is the main problem with why that we're having a hard time maintaining potassium levels. Yes? Yes.
Well, I was just curious, so if you're in early stages though, where do you weigh the benefits of the health of the food versus the detriments of the potassium?
That is an excellent question. When you have early stage kidney disease, okay, turns out your potassium problems tend not to be that much. It's only with advanced kidney disease when you're stage 4 and 5, and especially if you're diabetic. So this is the patient population I would be more careful about. But if you're stage 3, for instance, or early stage 4, you know, then your doctor will put you on medications which actually retain potassium, and you may wonder, wait, why am I on this medicine if my potassium is already high? And that is a discussion I would recommend you all have with your kidney doctor and talk with them that this is my plan. My plan is I want to protect my kidney and keep it in stage 3 or 4 without progression. So I am prepared to go on these medications, which are sort of the only proven medications to prevent kidney disease from progressing. But you have to take sort of the ownership of the potassium. That is the conversation you have to have with the kidney doctor. Yes?
You said about ACE inhibitors. Does that also
refer to the ARBs?
Absolutely. The ACE inhibitors, the losartan, that's an ARB. So just an easy way to remember, all the prils are ACE inhibitors and all the TANs are ARBs. Okay, just an easy way to remember, like lisinopril, fosinopril, they're all ACE inhibitors. Losartan, candesartan, valsartan, all the TANs will be ARBs. So typically these classes of medications, turns out, I tell my patients these are magic kidney pills. These are magic kidney pills. As long as you are able to maintain your potassium levels, because that is the price you pay. Yes?
I wouldn't know that corner, is that broccoli?
Say that again?
Is there broccoli in the corner?
Yes.
Broccoli? I thought broccoli.
You know, all fruits and vegetables have potassium, but you know, especially the brightly colored ones, you know, the bright oranges and reds tend to be the main culprits. Anything bright yellow, bright orange, bright red.
Avocados.
Huh?
Avocados.
Bright green, yeah, let me include
I'm
that
from
also.
Florida.
Okay,
Deadly.
any question on that? So that is why you need to pay attention to potassium, especially if you're late pre-dialysis or on dialysis. If you're a post-transplant patient with a well-functioning kidney, eat whatever you want. Within limits, right? Heart healthy diet, yes.
I thought you said something about the patient who went on a spree.
Yes.
Couldn't move
Yes.
her leg or something. What would that have? What's the connection?
I was talking about how the potassium can cause even muscle paralysis. And do you guys know about star fruit? Dialysis patients should never eat star fruit, okay? Because star fruit, it's not the potassium issue, but it can cause other neurologic problems. I was just reminded of that talking about fruits and vegetables, okay? So yeah, potassium, this is the problem, the diet and the pills. And talk to your dietitian, talk to your kidney doctor about the medication. There's actually a lot of strategies, by the way, we can use when someone's having problems with potassium, either pre-dialysis or on dialysis. There's a number of strategies we use. And I don't think we have time to go over those strategies. I'll be happy to talk to you guys after the lecture if you want to hear about them, okay? Now, let's talk about, how many of you have heard about bicarb? Bicarbonate? That's also typically in your printout of the labs. And I won't spend too much time on this because this tends not to be, you know, either too high or too low for a number of patients. It usually tends to be okay. But some patients, especially if you're diabetic, can have problems with the bicarb. And the bicarb is nothing but it's the alkali. Remember, in your body, the acid and the alkali have to be balanced. So when you have kidney disease, the acid doesn't get eliminated. So the acid level can go up and it can chew up all the bicarb, okay? Normal values, typically between 23 to 28. Oh, I'm sorry, I already put the stars up there. I didn't ask you guys the question this time. So again, if you have a well-functioning transplant kidney, things will be fine. But if you're pre-dialysis or dialysis, pay attention to the bicarb. Has anyone ever, let me ask, just show of hand, anyone has had problems with bicarb where you talk to the doctor and any thoughts on what they actually recommended? You don't have to, I mean, just what did they recommend typically? Yes?
Before I had my transplant, I took this awful tasting liquid. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, typically they will give you an alkali. They will give you the alkali to balance out the acid. Turns out most of the time that alkali is nothing but baking soda. It's just baking soda. So again, please do not take any baking soda without talking to your doctor because the dosage is very important. I've had a patient who once took lots of baking soda because she was having an upset stomach or something and comes in with bad problems because of that. So it may sound like a very harmless drug to neutralize the acid. Well, baking soda, we use it in cooking, right? It's not that harmless when you have kidney disease, right? But your doctor may prescribe it, so that's something to bear in mind, okay? This is the big one. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question. You said bicarbonate is acid. Is it different from uric acid?
It's totally different from uric acid. Uric acid, well, we can talk about it if we have time. I didn't plan on talking about uric acid, but we can talk if you're interested. This is where I want to focus most of the time on. Phosphorus. Everybody's, I mean, the dialysis patients all know that, you know, I mean, we are certainly guilty of it as doctors. We go to the dialysis unit or a PD unit and we just like tell the patient again, oh, your phosphorus is not good this month. You have to take care of your phosphorus. Did you take your binders? You know, we're certainly, so they get hounded upon by the doctors, by the dietitians, and you know, their family members to get the phosphorus into good control. So, I want to spend some time here because what's all this big deal about this phosphorus? What is it really and why does it matter? Well, simply put, it's a chemical element. It's very important because it's there in your body, especially in your bones and teeth. Okay, anywhere there's calcium, there's phosphorus within. So in your bones and teeth. Also, it's there in a lot of your cell membranes. They have phospholipids. Okay, and you guys probably know this, that a healthy normal range in the blood is anywhere between 3 and 4.5. However, when you look at all these lab results, it can be pretty intimidating to remember their names and their normal ranges. I tell my patients, very simple to remember, rule of 5. Rule of 5. 5 for the potassium, 5 for the phosphorus. Very simple. If you keep it around that or less than that, you're good to go. Very simple, right? Potassium, phosphorus, 5 or less. Because it can be challenging to remember all these normal ranges and you know whatnot. Now, let me ask you guys this question. We talked about potassium and its problems. What is the problem with the phosphorus in kidney disease? So what if the phosphorus accumulates in the body? And first of all, why does it accumulate? Because turns out the kidney is one of the major organs where what goes in must come out, right? And I'll walk you through a little diagram. Okay, so this is your kidney, the center of my universe at least. And so you take in phosphorus. Can anyone throw a bunch of foods that have phosphorus in them? Any?
Whole grains.
Whole grains, yes.
Nuts.
Milk, nuts, cheese. All the good foods. All the good foods have too much phosphorus in them, which is really unfair. But anyway, we eat the phosphorus foods and we expect the kidney to eliminate them. Now, when it doesn't eliminate it, where does it go? It needs to go somewhere, right? Turns out it tends to go to 2 places which are really bad. The heart, blood vessel. That is the problem. See, because we have no out here. What comes in must go out. If it can go out, it has to go somewhere. It goes and sits in the heart, especially in the heart valves. It goes and sits in the blood vessels and stiffens the blood vessels, which is not okay. You know, it can cause other problems. And this is another important thing as an aside, but I'll be talking about this later. The phosphorus, when it's up, it goes and tickles your parathyroid gland. It tickles it. So the parathyroid gland now releases a whole bunch of parathyroid hormone, which goes and likes to chew up the bone. I tell my patients the parathyroid hormone is like Pac-Man. You know how the Pac-Man goes like this in the game? Chewing up everything along the way. The parathyroid hormone is Pac-Man because it does that to the bone. Clips it. So, that is why it's important to control the phosphorus. Now, question to you guys. Why is it so difficult to control phosphorus? It's in everything. All the best foods. Cheese, pizza, milk, yogurt, nuts. Meat. One of my attending professors when I was a fellow used to tell me, Shubha, you know how you tell the patients which food has high phosphorus? They need to look at the cow. Anything that comes from the cow is phosphorus. The meat, the milk, the cheese, the yogurt, the ice cream, the pizza, everything is phosphorus, right? This is one big problem. What is the other big problem? Why is it that especially dialysis patients have trouble keeping up the phosphorus in range? Why? Because our machine here is really lousy at getting rid of phosphorus. How many of you guys knew that? How many of you thought the machine does a good job at removing phosphorus? Can you raise your hand? The machine does a very good job of removing small particles like BUN, creatinine. It does a not good job of removing bigger particles like phosphorus. So I'm going to put a little plug here for those of you who can do this. Home dialysis frequently or nighttime dialysis, nocturnal dialysis, removes phosphorus very good. So in other words, the 3 times a week doesn't remove as much. But if you did that 6 times a week, for instance, at home, or if you do a prolonged session at nighttime, the phosphorus becomes excellent. In fact, when I was in Canada, we had a lot of patients on nighttime dialysis where they did the same hemodialysis at home, except they did it at night when they went to bed. 8-hour session. Nobody, I would say, well, probably less than 5% of patients were taking phosphorus binders. Yes?
How about peritoneal dialysis?
Peritoneal is probably similar to the 3 times a week. But probably slightly better than that. I think it's somewhere in between. But still, peritoneal dialysis is not that great. You still have to take binders, that is. But, you know, all is not lost, right? Because we know that the main problem is because of this, and because the 3 times a week doesn't remove it that well. So that is why we have to depend on these guys, right? Probably a lot of you are already taking binders. The binders are what they are. You eat the food with the phosphorus and you pop these pills which act like magnets for the phosphorus. It goes and sops it up and you eliminate it in the stool. But again, that's a big problem. It's adding to your pill burden, right? As it is, kidney patients are taking a number of pills, right? I mean, you may have diabetes, you're taking pills for diabetes, high blood pressure, your cholesterol, and you're taking either ACE inhibitors or something to protect the kidney, and you have to take these pills, the binders. So it's a challenge, and I recognize that. And you know, it's, to me personally, that's one of the hardest parts of my job, to sit down and talk to a patient about what they should be eating, because, you know, I feel bad to do that, honestly, because it is hard. It is a big challenge. I mean, how can you tell them curtail this, curtail that, when all this is such delicious food? Anyway, but we have to tell them that just because of the bad effects of phosphorus, which I mentioned a while ago. So some of you may be taking these binders, Tums, Foslo, Renvela, Fosrenol, and so on. Yes?
When would a person start taking binders?
Yeah, good question. Typically, most of the 3 times a week dialysis patients and most PD patients are taking binders.
What about the chronic kidney disease?
Yeah, chronic kidney disease
Who's
patients,
not on dialysis?
yes, they tend to have not much phosphorus problems until they are very close to dialysis. Okay, they tend to have not as much phosphorus problems and the need for binders. Okay, good question. Now this is just a chart to show you how our traditional 3 times a week dialysis does to remove the phosphorus. Typically in our diet, we take in about 1,000 milligrams of phosphorus in a week. You're taking in about, say, 7,000, right? You don't absorb all that phosphorus. You're absorbing about roughly 4,000 of it. The dialysis turns out, it removes 800, for instance, per session. And if you are 3 times a week, it's removing around 2,400. So you're unaccounted for about close to 2,000 milligrams of phosphorus, which will be building up inside you if it's not removed. So what are the strategies we use? We use binders so that this portion can increase, the absorption will become less. We use binders. Or we intensify this from 3 times a week. Say you made it 6 times a week, right? You're going to remove more phosphorus, right? So these are some of the strategies we use for phosphorus control. Any questions? Now, strategies to control the phosphorus levels. We already sort of talked about the food choices and working with the renal dietitian and the phosphorus binders. This is another thing, which is the more frequent dialysis, which is home dialysis or nighttime dialysis, to aid more phosphorus removal. There is one more strategy, which I think I should share with you, because a lot of times, both as doctors and as patients, we forget this strategy. Okay? Anybody can tell me what I'm referring to? I'll give you a clue. It's related to food. It's related to food, but not just the regular food we eat on a day-to-day basis. That's a clue. Because I'm certainly guilty of it. I don't readily talk to my patients, regularly about this. Food additives. Consider food additives. Okay? And I'll tell you why. It's actually a big deal. You may or may not have thought about this. You may or may not have talked about this to your kidney doctor. But let's talk about it now. What are these additives? They are phosphorus additives. They actually put phosphorus in a lot of the processed foods. Why? Because of these reasons. It makes the food creamier, like ice cream. It allows foods that would not normally melt to melt and keep it like sort of liquidy. It maintains the juiciness of meat. It prevents beverages from separating into individual ingredients, makes food last longer. There's a number of reasons why in the food industry they add phosphate or phosphorus additives. You may be surprised if you actually look at the labels. If you find, these are some of the, this list is not even exhaustive. These are just some of the phosphate additives in the food. And how do you know if the food that you're eating has these phosphorus additives? Before that, you may ask me, does that make such big difference? It's like a food additive, right? It's not the main food. Turns out, they've done studies on this, up to 1/3 of your phosphorus intake when you're on dialysis or pre-dialysis, or general population, up to 1/3 of your phosphorus intake is actually from the additives. Isn't that, that's something to think about. I'll give you an example. This is Diet Coke.
Oh yeah.
That's why your dietitian probably tells you Coke is not good for you when you're trying to balance your phosphorus. Do you see this here? Phosphoric acid. To make it easy for you, I'm just going to tell you, if it starts with a phos, it has a phosphorus food additive in it, okay? It starts with a phos. I'll give you another example. This is a cake mix. You might think, cake mix, well, what does that have? Let's look in and see here. Look at that. Aluminum phosphate, right? Phos. So that additive can be hidden, and usually it's in the packaged foods. Usually it's in the packaged foods. So that is why, they made it so much easier now with labeling of everything. And before we go there, I want to just mention there was actually a big study that was done where what they did was, it was a very, very nice study. They took a bunch of dialysis units, right? The dietitian went to just half the units and told the patients, okay, this is what we're going to do as a strategy. We'll just kind of read labels and not buy anything from the grocery that has the word phos in it from the labels. That's all was the intervention they did. And the other control group of patients, they didn't tell them to do that. They just, gave them the usual phosphorus advice, limit dairy, limit nuts or whatever. Turns out they actually found a big difference, a significant difference in the level of phosphorus just by removing the additives. So, that's something I thought I'd share with you guys because, like I said, it's not something we typically would, tell our patients, but we should. So, just to wind up the phosphorus and potassium issue, the 2 P's, I tell my patients this. Especially when you're on dialysis, remember the 2 P's, phosphorus and potassium. And what's the magic number?
5.
5, very good. So, and patients get sometimes confused about this. What has phosphorus in it and what has potassium in it because it sounds similar. Just remember, something related to the cow is phosphorus. And something related to like fresh fruits and vegetables, something colorful is all potassium.
So what's not up there? What's not up there?
You know what? You make a very valid point. Some of my patients with kidney disease and diabetes, they tell me, well, guess what? My diabetes doctor tells me to eat whole grains for the diabetes, but whole grains have a lot of phosphorus in them. What do? Unfortunately, fortunately for me, I tell them, I think you should see the dietitian. I sort of take the easy route out and I tell them you should see the dietitian who might give you more advice. But your point is well taken. It's extremely frustrating and it's a very hard thing to manage. And talk to a dietitian, that's my advice. Let's talk briefly about parathyroid hormone. I already mentioned this briefly. You might see this in your lab report. The parathyroid hormone is Pac-Man, remember that. It goes and clips the bone. That's why it's P for P. And these are 4 little glands in your neck, and these glands actually make this. Your doctor, your dietitian, they usually refer to it as PTH. The expansion is parathyroid hormone. So when these glands make this hormone, can anyone, from a few prior slides, anyone tell me what parathyroid hormone does? Why is it harmful when it's high?
Well, I know that it pulls calcium, tricks the body to thinking there's no calcium, and it pulls it out.
So it weakens the bone. That's one of the main effects. But there's also a number of other effects which we won't get into today. But that is why it's important to look at that lab, okay? Quiz time. Tell me, who needs to be aware of this? Is it the pre-dialysis patient, is it the dialysis patient, or the post-transplant patient with a well-functioning kidney?
Certainly pre-dialysis.
Okay, so Dorothy says certainly pre-dialysis. Any other answers? Dialysis patients for sure. What about the post-dialysis patient with a well-functioning kidney transplant? That was a trick question. Guess what? All 3 gets a star. Okay? All 3 has to pay attention because, and I'll tell you why. Pre-dialysis and dialysis patients, okay, well, the PTH elevation goes along with the fact that you have kidney disease and your phosphorus is going up. Why is it that a post-transplant patient, your kidney is working just fine, why does the PTH go up? It's because some patients whose glands have become, while they were on dialysis, it's like become so big and muscular and overgrown that it's still functioning at that level even post-transplant. Does that make sense? That is why for those of you who've had a kidney transplant, even if your transplant is working well, I would recommend just check it, especially in the first couple of years after transplant, because we need to make sure those levels are actually starting to come down. If it's, yes?
What about whether the vitamin D levels are really low, then the PTH hormone goes really high?
Yes, excellent question. So that, the vitamin D is a hormone that if it is very low, that can also make these glands to function and make too much of the hormone. So I agree with you completely. You need to have your vitamin D levels checked, and your vitamin D levels have to be normalized and see if these levels come down.
Can the calcium that's been pulled out
Vitamin D?
or is it constantly systemic?
That's a beautiful question. Turns out that, and certainly Dr. Tropman might have done many surgeries for the parathyroid gland. Turns out that, if the parathyroid gland has been so overactive that it's been pulling out calcium from your bone and weakening the bone, turns out that a lot of times when you take those glands out, say by surgery, the bones actually start sucking in all the calcium back. So that's definitely a possibility that they get mineralized back again once this process stops.
Only if you take them out?
No, that's one of the methods. But there's a number of strategies we use to reduce this level. For example, when what she mentioned, adding vitamin D, for example, if you're deficient. Or some of you may be on medications in the dialysis unit called Sensipar or Calcijex, Calcitriol, Hectorol, Zemplar, and so on. These medications actually also help reduce the levels of this. That is the reason you're taking that medication.
But if your calcium is high, you can't take some.
Yes, if your calcium is high though, you may be left with the only option of using Sensipar. That is sort of the only, I'm sorry I'm using a lot of, non-pharmacologic names here, but I'm using it because I think that's what people are familiar with. Yes?
Yes, I'm just wondering why I'm a post-transplant and why do sometimes my vitamin D level goes down out of a vitamin D treatment and it's getting better, but why?
That's because if you take the general US population, even even, I mean, if you have healthy kidneys, in the general use population, the level of vitamin D deficiency is so common, that's why. So it translates into everybody, whether or not you have kidney disease.
Can you supplement the vitamin D with over-the-counter or herbal supplements?
I tell my patients really to be wary about herbal supplements because the main reason is because I don't know what's in them. And nobody has done, has really looked into, what exactly goes into the manufacturing process and so on. But certainly over-the-counter vitamin D, which has just vitamin D and not any other herbal supplements or a prescription vitamin D, certainly will help or might help lowering these levels. But if you have advanced kidney disease and especially if you're on dialysis, turns out just supplementing vitamin D may not be enough in bringing down these levels. You will need something stronger, like one of those other medications we talked about, or in very severe cases, you may need to see Dr. Trotman for surgery. Any other questions, or can we move on to the next? Yes?
Yeah, I just had it's kind of confusing. Maybe you could talk at some point, it doesn't have to right this second, but just on supplements, because sometimes they say to take the vitamin D, or they say to take calcium, but then you got to watch for all the other things in the if there are other supplements.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you want to touch on that now or afterwards, but just how you monitor what's okay to take and what isn't there.
So when you take vitamin D, or when you take, say, calcium as a binder, for instance, for the phosphorus, the most important thing is to get follow-up labs checked. Because otherwise we have no idea where your levels are and what it's doing to you. That is why when you're a pre-dialysis patient, I see my pre-dialysis patients every 3 months with labs. So that is why it's important to have that regular follow-up and adjust your supplements based on what your labs are. Because, the kidney disease management, really a lot of it, we really need the labs because we don't have a magical, lens or whatever to look in to see what's happening. And, and most of the time they cause no symptoms. So we really depend on the labs. Okay, I think this is the final lab I'm going to talk to you guys about. How many of you guys have heard about KT over V? Certainly, if you're on dialysis, you've heard about it. If you're if you're post-transplant, you might have heard about it. If you're pre-dialysis, you may not have heard about this lab yet, but let's just talk about it. KT over V, just look at this slide. Clean. So it tells you how clean the blood is. That's all it tells you. So it's just a number, okay? It makes no sense if you look at the number 1.5, 1.7. It makes no sense really, but it's just a way where you know how the dialysis is working for you. Whether you're on PD or hemo, doesn't matter. We look at the KT over V. And don't really bother about what exactly it stands for, but just remember that reflects the cleaning. Who is it important for? Which patient should be looking at their lab report for the KT over V? Excellent. Woo. That's it. So if you're pre-dialysis or post-transplant, you're not going to see these labs in your lab report. Okay? Now, what does that mean? The KT over V number really, it actually varies depending on whether you're on PD or hemo. Okay? It's that number which you should really know about. We usually use the number 1.3, 1.4 in our 3 times a week hemo patients and 1.7 for PD patients. And if that number is less than that, say in a PD patient, the KT over V number is now 1.2. What does that mean? Any thoughts? It means we're not doing a good job of cleaning your blood. That's what it means, okay? So, in a hemo patient, same thing holds true. Say the number is not 1.4, but it's at 1.1. Studies have shown that if you fall less than that threshold number, they tend not to do so well. That is why the nephrologist may talk to you about certain strategies to improve that number. One of the strategies that's used is to increase the time on dialysis or add extra days. So it's basically, it's like the cleaning crew. You just need to augment the cleaning crew. The dialysis needs to be augmented. So that's that magic number. Okay. Oh, I have one more lab to talk about. Hemoglobin. Everyone knows about this, right? And this turns out all the labs so far we talked about, you know, most of them are like waste products that accumulate because the kidney is not getting rid of them. But this is one unique situation where the hemoglobin is abnormal in your labs because the kidney is not making erythropoietin. What is erythropoietin? It sounds like a scary name. Erythropoietin is nothing but a signal that the kidney sends to your bone marrow to make red blood cells. So when your kidney is not functioning, you don't have that signal, so your bone marrow is not making new red blood cells efficiently. Does that make sense? So your red blood cells go lower and you're anemic. What are the strategies we use to improve the hemoglobin? If you're low in iron, your nephrologist may prescribe iron for you, but because the main problem is the lack of production of erythropoietin, sometimes we use shots. You guys may have heard about those shots, Epogen, Aerones. Yes?
What about a really low?
Pardon?
What about a really low potassium?
That is not good too. A very, very low potassium, you know, can cause muscle weakness too and paralysis. But that tends not to be the case for most kidney patients. Kidney patients have problems excreting the potassium.
Are there long-term effects from having too much potassium regularly, like there is with phosphorus?
Very good question. You know, the problem with that is, with a high phosphorus, it's a silent thing. It just builds up over time. You don't even know it's building up until a few years later, we find all the blood vessels are full of phosphorus and calcium. Whereas on the other hand, the potassium, if it is high, you'll know right away because, you know, chances are either the patient will get muscle weakness if it's very high, or they may have a cardiac arrest even, unfortunately. So it doesn't take time for it to declare itself unless a phosphorus problem. Yes?
Yeah, can you explain what AST and ALT is and if
Sure.
there's a trend up with that?
AST and ALT are measures of your liver function. It's typically, you know, we look at it in the dialysis patients. On the monthly labs, they just report it out. It tends not to fluctuate too much if you have no other medical problems, but you have underlying hepatitis C or B, for instance, then we look at it more closely. Now the next question. Everybody deals with your kidney disease differently. What issue do you see most commonly hindering a patient's path to managing the disease? Is it lack of social support, finances, unwillingness to adhere to a diet or medication, etc.? And I think the answer is all of the above. It's all of the above. Kidney disease cannot be handled it's a team effort, and you absolutely need the social support and the support from your doctors, your dietitian, your team. It's a team effort. Because I can honestly say that especially my dialysis patients, they have some of the most challenging, decisions to make on a day-to-day basis, starting from even dietary choices. So, and I really admire them for that, and so it's certainly a team effort. I think it's all of the above. Before I went into stage 4 CKD, my hemoglobin was high normal 12 to 14. Since my transplant, I have a hard time getting it to stay in the 11 to 12 range. Is there anything I can do to increase my hemoglobin? The answer to that is, the post-transplant patients sometimes become anemic. See, when you're on dialysis, you get EPO, right? And you maintain your hemoglobin. When you're post-transplant, the thought process is your kidney now makes erythropoietin and, the anemia improves. But some of them, because of medication use, such as Cellcept and so on, they may have a little anemia. This is not a terrible level to be, 11 to 12, that's quite acceptable. What I would recommend is look for anything else that's reversible. For example, is your iron stores okay? Is your B12 and folic acid levels okay? And they can check for all that. Short of that, I wouldn't recommend anything else like Epogen, for example, because of what I told you before. We do not want to raise the hemoglobin to 12 to 14 anymore. That's all 10 years back, okay? So just look for something reversible. Last question is there any way to test the peritoneum to see if repeated infections have compromised the ability to use peritoneal dialysis? Yeah, the answer to that is the simple test is the KT over V. If you've had repeated infections and it's sort of thickened your membrane and it's not getting good clearances or good valves, check your KT over V number. But more than that, it's how you feel. Turns out in Canada, they don't even measure the KT over V because they go by how the patient feels. And but we have here in the US, it's mandatory reporting of KT over V, so we have to measure it. But yeah, that's one test you can use. Also, whether you're getting good enough, ultrafiltration on peritoneal dialysis. There's a number of things you can do. Yes?
If a patient has accumulated high phosphorus, is there any way to reverse that?
Absolutely. I'll tell you an interesting story. There was a patient who was on dialysis for a number of years and used to have all these lumps under the skin, and they were all calcium phosphorus deposits. And turns out, once the patient had a parathyroidectomy, the parathyroid gland was gone. All that disappears magically. And sometimes even post-transplant that disappears. Or sometimes they go on nocturnal dialysis, for example. It can get better. There's a lot of strategies to reduce the phosphorus. Yes, it can happen. Any other question?
I wonder if you just might comment on maintaining magnesium after transplant or doing the Prograf.
Yeah, that's a common problem with Prograf use. The magnesium levels tend to stay low. We use magnesium supplements in some patients. Unfortunately, it's not well tolerated because it can cause diarrhea. So, we sort of live with a lower number. As long as it's not dangerously low. Any other questions? Yes?
Post-transplant, how many liters of water would you recommend to take?
Yes.
To help the kidney?
I'm very glad you asked me this question. And this is not only post-transplant, this also holds true for pre-dialysis patients. This is a question I often get asked. How much water should I drink? I've been told I have to drink 8 glasses of water a day or whatever, 10 glasses of water a day. Turns out, unless you're really what we call volume depleted or dehydrated, other than that particular situation where you really have to keep yourself hydrated, for example, if you had lots of diarrhea or vomiting, then you're really dehydrated. But you just eat and drink like a normal person would, There's no magic volume you drink to flush the kidneys out. There is nothing like that. Just normal intake is good enough unless you're dehydrated. Anybody else? Or Dr. Trockman, if you have more questions for Dr. Trockman about the transplant. Well, thank you very much for having us. And if you have any